Before we get to the heart of the event, I need to say just a few words about the history of the Jesuits so that we know what we're talking about. And while periodizations like the Middle Ages or the Renaissance are risky and problematic, I'm going to take a risk and sort of slice things up. One could say that there have been, in the past half millennia, 3 societies of Jesus. The first was founded only a little over 2 decades after the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. It had an extraordinary trajectory. Within a century of the death of its founder, Ignatius of Loyola, there were tens of thousands of Jesuit brothers and priests. There were hundreds of schools all over the world. The Jesuits were the most envied, sometimes admired, sometimes reviled religious organization in the world. And one of my British colleagues has even made the comment that they were the first multinational corporation. And that's not bad. The 18th century involved a number of body blows to the society, some of which were self-inflicted. Not only did their rivals, enemies, and others go about trying to pull them down, they also had a lot of, if not cash buried in the ground, they owned a great deal of property. In Bohemia, they owned almost 1/3 of the kingdom in terms of real estate. But they also were so good at what they'd been doing that they didn't keep up. Enlightenment science, vernacular education, changing views of church and state caught them on the wrong foot. They were more often reactive than proactive, and by 1773, having already been kicked out of the colonial empires of Portugal, Spain, and France, they were banned by the Pope with a very big asterisk because they survived in a number of shadowy circumstances for 41 years, including in the Empire the Great of Russia. So I've called this the Baroque Society just to give it a label. I may be using that word again. There's a 41-year suppression. On the eve of Waterloo, when the Congress of Vienna has already sat down to put Europe back together after Napoleon, another pope, a rather more sympathetic pope, reinstates the society, and this is seen as the resurrection of the Society of Jesus. However, they don't get their stuff back. And I don't mean just their wealth, their tolls on bridges, their breweries. They had some great breweries. But they don't get their libraries back. And they don't get the access to the major mainline European universities that, with ups and downs, they had access to in the 17th and even into the 18th century. And without turning this into a Jesuit lecture, a number of things happen, which is that the Jesuits have more to do with outside of Europe than inside of Europe than they did before. And when they are inside of Europe, too often they are reactive, politically very conservative, allied to reactionary forces, and often looking as if they end up on the wrong arguments, wrong sides of lots of arguments ranging from geology to Darwinian evolution. Circa 1948, I pondered this date for a long time because I can't tell you a day when the sun came up and the Third Society was born. But somewhere between the end of the Second World War and the opening of Vatican II, 13 years later, something changes with the Jesuits. They, many, and we're talking about 20,000 men, so I don't want to overgeneralize, but many leaders of the Jesuits begin thinking of a new vision for the society, a break with this 19th century conservatism. And I would say the fact that a Jesuit Pope has recently given the Cardinal's hat to a Canadian Jesuit known for his work in social reform and whose coat of arms, I just learned today, has, this is Cardinal Czerny, It has a refugee boat on his coat of arms with the word suscipe below it. Take them up. It's a biblical reference, but it's also a very timely reference. This new Jesuit order was reborn, maybe not in a day, but it grew by leaps and bounds, especially under the generalate of Pedro Arrupe. This is 60s and 70s. I won't dwell on this, but if you can just keep these things in mind, there is a thread. I'm not saying that there's no connections among these three iterations, incarnations of the Jesuits, but the cultures are quite different, and they reflect directly on what happens in the world of Orthodox Christians. Okay. Some things work, some things don't work when Jesuits meet Eastern Christians. That's a very nice way to put it. There may be Jesuits in this room, so I'm trying to be real low-key. But first of all, the role of the spoken word is important in both cultures. And I won't pretend to nearly know as much about Orthodox cultures as about Jesuit cultures, but Jesuit cultures of this early period would very much be along the lines of, let's have a debate. I'm going to win, but let's have a debate anyway, because I have all these arguments, I have all these quotations I can provide, I can talk a mile a minute. Have you read my book? Okay? Orthodox cultures value the spoken word, but debate, performance is not a key aspect. But let me mention that these themes overlap and intersect. One affects another. The Jesuits of the first period see themselves as a reincarnation of the primitive church, and they love to talk up martyrdom issues. Virginity, martyrdom, sanctity in terms of being set apart. In the first of the three models, few Jesuits I'm aware of ever get used to the idea of an Orthodox priest who plows on weekdays and prays on Sunday, and who, this is really bad, has a wife and kids. This is really something that is very, very difficult. And just to say a word about the founding legends of the Jesuits, the founder was a soldier, Ignatius of Loyola. He takes a hit from a cannonball. He has a long recovery period. He has a conversion experience. And when he makes his switch to a life that will lead to sainthood, he hangs his sword on an altar in Manresa in Spain. And the symbolism is, this is the sort of relationship that he's going to have with women. It's going to be there, but there's a very courtly and chivalrous piece. He's not getting ready to marry the Virgin. Now that said, Ignatius, the pre-saintly personality, had relationships with women. We know this, and some of them are kind of interesting, but I really couldn't find a way to fit them into this talk, so I'm not going to do those right now. But anyway, so sanctity and virtue. And Jesuits are expounding sanctity and virtue in schools that they bring to these communities, and some of these ideas are quite alien. I mentioned performance and debate. Performance is huge in this first period. And then terminology. All the way through the old Jesuit documents that I've seen in many archives, you find the word the Orthodox Church over and over again. But you know who they're talking about? Their church. Orthodox people, and you would get the Greek etymological argument for this very, very quickly. Orthodox people on a good day are Photians, and he was a person who was called a schismatic. On a bad day, it gets much, much worse than that. And coupled with we're the Orthodox is the accusation made by Jesuits towards Orthodox clergy that Orthodox clergy are simply unlettered. And they don't know stuff. They don't know who the saints are. They don't know even what they're saying. For their part, many Orthodox lay and religious people see the Jesuits as hustlers. as schemers. And I'm certainly not fluent in either Ukrainian or Romanian, but I have picked up the fact that to Jesuit in both languages is not a compliment. To this day. Okay, now to get to some geography. The story of Jesuits in the Orthodox world cannot be divorced from power politics. And that would be true of Jesuits in colonial Africa in the 19th century and so on as well. But it's particularly intense in Eastern Europe. First off, we have to consider that Ukraine is adjacent to the Habsburg realms. Now, after the fact, we could call it the Habsburg Empire. In the 17th and 18th century, it is a hodgepodge of inherited political territories that isn't really an empire, but it's run out of Vienna, Austria, and a chunk of it by the 1770s will be under Austrian rule, but it's also adjacent. Transcarpathia, parts of it are historically part of the Kingdom of Hungary, whose crown is held by the Habsburg ruler, or the rulers, well, the ruler in all cases, I'll put it that way. So Jesuits will go into Transcarpathia, and on the one hand, they are, and let me also add, they are not Ukrainians. They are not ethnic Transcarpathians or Rusine people. That's important. They will come in with a great deal of sympathy, if not always understanding, but they are also agents of another culture, another language, and there's an ethnicity issue here that runs very, very deep, which I'll come back to in a little bit. In the many documents that I've looked at from the pre-1773 Jesuits operating in what is now Romania, I found only 3 who were identified as being fluent in Romanian. Now, the Jesuits, one, they keep extremely good records on their own men, and B, they take great care to say, and they even rank it, so-and-so, it has the mediocre skills in Italian, but it's very, very good in French, and so on. And the Romanian thing is just not in evidence. So the language leap in places like Transcarpathia, and I would generalize to Transylvania, that language leap is managed often by intermediaries who are not infrequently Jesuit brothers who may themselves have a different ethnic background than the university-educated guy from the West. And foreigner, Jesuits have had to bear a double burden worldwide, on the one hand, often being seen as foreigners wherever they go, but also being seen as people from nowhere, who are rootless cosmopolites, to use a later phrase. And in fact, the secret orders, the secret rules of the Jesuits published in the 17th century, if you put it alongside the protocols of the elders of Zion, you will see many a passage that is virtually identical. And of course the protocols are from 19th century. So wherever they go, they're foreigners. They're also quite typically city slickers. And this is very, very important. When the first school opened, or the first institute opened by the Jesuits was actually not for boys. It was for girls. It was in Rome, and it was to rescue girls from the streets of Rome and get them cleaned up and teach them skills so they could marry good Christian boys. But it was in a crossroads. If you've been to Rome, if you know where the Jesu is, it's smack dab, very old part of central Rome. So while there were Jesuits from the countryside, it is an organization, it was dreamed up in Paris, it was certified in Rome, and it was tested in the cities of southern Germany and Spain. So Jesuits are foreigners in terms of being city slickers. And that will turn out to be very important in Eastern Europe, which previous to World War I is just not a place with that many cities. Now, this is perhaps the main event for some of you, considering where we are here. The Jesuits are remembered today in some contexts as, and you'll even see this in books, I cringe, but as the shock troops of the counter-reformation. This is a cliche that's kicked around. And there's no doubt that they did some shocking and that they were involved in the counter-reformation. But we as people living in Canada, which has been so shaped by Northwestern Europe, we need to keep in mind that when they began, the Jesuits' vision was not particularly focused on the Protestant parts of Northern and Western Europe. In fact, Ignatius' first idea was to go to the Holy Land and to convert Muslims. The second project, happening contemporaneously with the regaining of Protestant places such as Poland. That didn't move that fast enough or something? Let's make it go away. Okay, but the other project is unifying people of Eastern Rite traditions with Rome and boiling that reunion down to the shortest possible checklist that you can go along with. And many of you may know much more about this from your point of view than I do, but this project to create churches that were in union with Rome, but which preserved many of the characteristics and theology of Eastern churches, this was never an easy path. For example, in Transylvania, which during this period is under Habsburg rule, and the Habsburgs are hyper-Catholic from time to time. Ferdinand II probably would have been a Catholic if he hadn't been, or would have been a Jesuit if he hadn't been born of imperial blood. So the Jesuits set out, and they, by the end of the 17th century, they have instituted a Uniate Church in the Grand Principality of Transylvania. A Uniate Bishop is installed. He is a person from Eastern tradition, but he has a theologus right at his elbow, a young, very talkative Jesuit, who it is rumored is writing letters to Rome every fortnight. So even if one could accept the moving of Easter, the filioque clause with which the Holy Spirit emanates from both the Son and the Father, and you have no problems with those things, there's always this question of, who's this German guy who's with our bishop? And to be fair, and I don't know how many Jesuits are in this room, but while Jesuits certainly have a history and a documented record of acts of incredible generosity and humility in this period, there were a couple of Jesuits who weren't always super humble. Okay? So we're all human. You know, if you combine, he's German, he's a city slicker, just what is his job description? And then you factor in other interesting things. On the plus side, the first book published in the Rusyn language was published in a Jesuit press in part of what is now Slovakia. Many books published in Romanian, many path-breaking books, many scholars trained in Uniate managed schools taught by Jesuits who helped institute what has been called the Transylvanian Renaissance of the late 18th and early 19th century. All great stuff and important stuff, and acknowledged today in Romania and other places. But at the same time, censorship of books. Censorship of books. Now, I've said a little bit about this. The Rusyn situation, I want to contrast this with the Ukrainian situation. The Rusyn people, the majority of them were under Habsburg, which is to say Holy Roman Emperor sort of rule during this period. Ukraine, as it appears in those old atlases, Little Russia, is under a different regime during these years. The Jesuits managed to come in periodically, but most of their influence in Rusyn is direct, because there isn't much of a literary or scholarly tradition. In Kiev, it is indirect. You have people like Petro Mohyla, he would never admit this, I suspect, but reading books printed in Italy from Jesuit presses and saying, yeah, grammar first, then prose, then poetry, then philosophy, then theology. That sounds right. Well, let's fix it up and bring it in. Other influences as they go east, again, secondary, architectural, and even poetic. So there's, if you can imagine the Habsburg lands, there's powerful influence, and then beyond that there is secondary influence. Also during this same period, Poland, which had really ceased to be a Catholic society, becomes very Catholic again. And Hungary, which had become so non-Catholic, first parts of Hungary, they had first been Lutheran, and then many leaders took the next step and became Calvinists, and then some guys just went for it and became Unitarians, and then the Turks showed up, and the Bishop of Vienna says, "See, go fix this. This is what happens when you open the door." So, but that story is not a Ukrainian story, of course. It's a very, very different story, both for overtly political reasons, a relationship with the Russian Empire, but also for linguistic reasons and geographical reasons. And while there are a few, more than a few, stray old Korans in Ukraine today, they're not there because the Ottoman Turks had been marching through. I mentioned this fellow. Okay, the ethnic dynamic thing is fascinating to me. German speakers with German-sounding last names in Hungarian-speaking parts of Eastern Europe, ethnic Hungarians and ethnic Romanians still haven't got this sorted out to this day. There's still some bad vibes. Ethnic Hungarians operating in Romanian-speaking regions, both of those top groups leaking into Ukraine periodically, but also frequently being kicked out. During the time of Peter the Great, there are Jesuits at the imperial court. I was just saying to Lynn last night that this one guy, he was a nobleman and he converted to Catholicism. He was a Russian noble. He becomes a Jesuit. He's sent to Siberia, hence the reference to Siberia. He comes back, he survives, and there's all these adventure stories, and they would make a wonderful Hollywood plot, but they don't end up to qualitative major impact on Russian imperial culture in the 17th and 18th centuries. There's a guy named Passavino, an Italian Jesuit of Jewish descent, and in another context, I'd love to tell you about Jesuits of Jewish descent, but that isn't the title of this talk, because that's and Ignatius occasionally would apparently say, "Oh, I wish I was Jewish because then I'd be descended, or I'd be related directly to my Savior." And I picture his friends going, "Shut up, be quiet," because this is Spain in the 16th century. But that's a bit off topic anyway. And then the Romanian-speaking go-betweens, and I'm going to say a few words about that because not only is history written by winners, but history is written by powerful people. You know this. For 350 years of Jesuit historiography, most of it was written by Jesuits, or by unhappy ex-Jesuits occasionally, often for Jesuits. But the Jesuits who were doing the writing were priests. They were university educated. They were just as elitist as that reviewer felt I was, which is probably the affinity. But for every Jesuit priest, in many of these communities, there's one or two Jesuit brothers. And not only are these guys the spiritual bedrock of a lot of these communities, they're not dummies. They're pharmacists, musical instrument builders. They frequently have family ties locally in places like Serbia, also in Ukraine. And they are the important go-betweens. When you have a Jesuit pharmacy, let's say in Lviv, which is then Lemberg in those days in Austrian territory, you go to the pharmacy you're going to see a Jesuit brother who knows all the, a Jesuit brother discovered quinine, by the way, a Jesuit brother there who will speak your language better than the priest will, and who will help you get the stuff that you need. They were also frequently the architects. And when plague would come around, and there's some very interesting stories, the Jesuits, they didn't know what to do about plague. No one, of course, did in those times. And so the classic 17th century remedy was, let's all get bled. But a Jesuit brother would do this because he's also the community barber. So fun combinations of things. Now, I need to say a little bit about ex-Jesuits and the East. Every religious order, every religious movement has had people who left the movement, and sometimes they're famous just for leaving the movement. The Jesuits, perhaps because of the size and longevity of their organization, they have a number of extremely interesting guys who left the order. Adam Franciszek Kolar was a Jesuit until his 40s, and he did all kinds of interesting things. He's basically the father of the term ethnology. He was a linguist. He taught himself Persian. He was the librarian of the court library in Vienna. But he produced a document which has never been published or edited, but which a few people, including Professor Mogocci, who is now emeritus, who taught here in Toronto, has worked on, and basically, you see the translation below it. This is the first description of the folkways, if you will, the language, the religious practices, and the economic conditions of the Rusine people. I know I'm talking a lot about Rusines, but and note the date, it's quite early. And this is suggestive of something else. This is an extreme case that many Jesuits were involved in, less officially, in the Orthodox world. They weren't all trying to write ethnographic studies. But, for example, Jesuits who went through Imperial Russia, heading east. Some ended up in Siberia. Some were among the Kalmuks on the Sea of Azov. They wrote about what they saw as they went. And while Jesuits were, just as much as any other person of the 17th or 18th centuries, limited in their vision, biased in their interpretations, sometimes blinded, or sometimes seeing stuff that we don't think was even there. Nonetheless, their Jesuit formation had told them to note detail in costume, in speech, in flora and fauna and architecture, and also, and they perhaps went a bit too far in the Baroque era, for connections. To do what my, hope I can bring that back, what my Scottish colleague Peter Davison has called identifying equivalencies. Now, sometimes some Jesuits go way too far. A Jesuit seeing a sculpture on a Hindu temple in India that is a three-headed figure and saying, oh, Trinity. Write it down, it's the Trinity. Probably a little too far. But Jesuits traveling across an Eastern European landscape, being in different places in a relatively short period of time, they noticed footwear. They noticed that the word for bread and that the word for certain ground squirrels was the same among the Lap people as it was among Hungarians. Okay? This is good. And mind you, on that expedition, they were going up north to observe a transit of Venus. So this crew, they were actually astronomers, but they were also doing some lens grinding. And of course, they were trying to convert everyone that would stand still and listen to them. But these records are invaluable. In some, even when you allow for the things that they get hilariously wrong or that they just can't see or refuse to see, in many cases these are priceless observations from rather sensitive observers. And this man would be the top of the list of those kinds of guys. A few words about Greece. Now, when I was asked to do some writing about Jesuits and the Orthodox world a few years ago, and I got into it. And I had a moment of near depression because a lot of the encounters were simply sad. They were miscommunications. They were totally refusing to see the legitimacy of other ways of being and so on. And then I got to sunny Greece. And the Greek story, while it is far from perfect, and there's a guy, a bishop named Cyril Lucaris, who ends up floating face down in the Aegean. It didn't go very well for him, but for many of the encounters on the Greek islands, all of which are ruled by Ottomans in this first period, there's mutual respect. There's a sharing of all sorts of things, including religious services. And I was puzzled by this. And my theory is every Jesuit priest and some brothers had extensive training in classical Greek culture via the literature. So say you're from Marseille or you're from Cologne or somewhere, you're a Western European Catholic sort of person, and you're perfectly willing to believe that anyone who lives east of the Vistula is a big stinky bear. But you go to Greece, and yes, your Greek is very, very different, but you have a sense you are not only in a place where some of the greatest, you've read Homer or you've had chunks of it, you're also standing there where St. Paul was. Right. You're in Corinth. You're in Athens, the Hill of Mars. And yes, it's all different, and they're talking Turkish and so on. So there are some very, very bright moments. And one of the things that these Jesuits did with much more success than, say, in Ukraine, is that the Jesuits loved to write dramas. My gosh, they would recycle drama plots, but in Hungary alone, during this Baroque period, there are 8,000 titles of Baroque drama. Now, I think plots were massively recycled. I think Daniel and the Lion's Den got done a lot of times in slightly different versions. But nonetheless, Jesuit drama was an immense... First of all, it got the local folks, like, let's go to the Jesuit drama tonight. It's free, you know. And then there's like some kind of religious service or something. So let's go have a look. Then, okay, the kids would get up and they would declaim in Latin and what have you. And then some parents might say, well, school's free too. Maybe I should get Antonius enrolled in this. Well, it didn't work that well in a place like Russia, to be honest, both because the dramatic tradition is completely different and the connecting of drama and the sacred, there isn't that Renaissance hook. But the Greeks love drama, big surprise. And the Jesuits wrote dramas in the Greek Isles, on the Greek Isles, excuse me, with Greek heroes in them. I don't mean ancient pagan Greek heroes like Heracles, but there's plenty of fine Greek martyrs and on and on and on, Santa Barbara, whatever you want to bring in. Jesuits also penetrated the Ottoman lands. This is slightly off topic, but I just want to mention that the first printing press in Constantinople, it may not have actually been assembled by hand by a Jesuit, but there was an Alsatian Jesuit standing right there over the Transylvanian convert to Islam, basically telling him, no, you put the Samech there. And there is this brief success, and during the period of the suppression, the Jesuits are basically, the Pope has cut them off. They're scattered around. They're surviving in Russia. A few go over to Georgetown in the New World. Many Jesuits stay on and continue. They live their whole lives in the Mediterranean East. I know a little bit about some Jesuits who stayed on in Thessalonica. I'm trying to run down 3 guys who French Jesuits who stayed in the Greek quarter of Cairo until they died. So there's interesting bits here. Now, Russian Empire, Soviet Union. When the Jesuits return in 1814, and as I mentioned, they are, I'm sorry, I'm moving around here. They're poorer, they're rather more restricted, but they are turning their eyes once more to the East. And it is during this period that a notable French Jesuit, or actually he's not French, he ends up being very French in his way of living, but his last name is Gagarin, just like the cosmonaut. He is a minor nobleman. He converts to Catholicism. He's, of course, disowned by his outraged family. And he publishes journals and builds a library outside of Paris, all in the project to get the Russian Church in union with Rome. It doesn't go very well, and I'm sorry to say that there ends up being some rather bad blood on both sides. The Orthodox simply see this as more scheming, and the other thing is, to be fair, most Jesuits weren't spies, okay? But some were. And those are the ones it's like, most left-handed people aren't car thieves, but, yeah. But, so there were some spies. Or at least they arrived with multiple assignments and multiple names. I've just been reading about one who said that his name was Francesco Emiliani, but apparently his name was also Jan Milan because he was from Czech Republic. So there are some difficult moments. The Russian intelligentsia, exemplified by some things that Dostoevsky wrote in the 19th century, are not super complimentary. For their part, the Jesuits crow rather unattractively, some of them, when the October Revolution comes, because this rotten old Orthodox Church is finally crumbling, and now will come our opening, which may be on the short list of the 10 worst predictions of the 20th century, because I'll leave him out for a minute. I've mentioned him because I need to go to this guy. I just need to keep track of where we're at. It's 6 o'clock. Okay, well, post-World War I. Here, the story of the Jesuits worldwide, but also in particular the Jesuits in the East, becomes completely intertwined with papal politics. And I need to say a little bit about this. Every Jesuit swears allegiance to the Pope, to the point of, if the Pope says you go now to the leper colony in Suriname and you're all done teaching at Harvard, you're supposed to go. That said, there's been a book written by a former colleague of mine in St. Louis called The Pope's Disobedient Sons, about the Jesuits. Because relations, not only did one pope ban Jesuits, but many other popes, including John Paul II, were not huge fans, to put it mildly. Come the end of the First World War, and this is a century ago, and it may be slightly hard for some of us to picture 1919, but the Bolsheviks have taken power in this gigantic country of Russia. There have also been Bolshevik attempts, or Bolshevik sympathizing attempts with varying degree of success, in Budapest, Munich, Rome, to a lesser extent, Glasgow, lots of places, and the Vatican's worried. This is a contagion. This isn't simply an unpleasant sect like the various Anabaptists that we'll have to put up with. This is actually very bad news. And the papacy, the Holy See, is scrambling to figure out what to do about this very serious situation. And as many of you, some of you may have read Cornwall's book, Hitler's Pope. The title is a bit unfair to Pius XII, but it nonetheless, many people in the Vatican and throughout the Catholic hierarchy, and a number of Jesuits, decide that the fascists are kind of creepy, but compared to the Bolsheviks, we'll have to do this thing. And remember, this is also in the year 1929, when finally the agreement after years of exile, is made between Mussolini's Italy and the Holy See. When you see the boulevard of conciliation that leads to St. Peter's in Rome, they're talking about Mussolini and the Pope. It's not about happy days with Protestants or anything like that. So in this context of great concern, this French Jesuit is sent on a mission to the very new, very violent, very xenophobic Soviet Union, where Stalin is arranging for tragic accidents to eliminate most of his immediate competition. Herbigny thinks that he's been made a bishop secretly, that he'll be able to ordain lots of people, including maybe some Catholic bishops, that the time is ripe for the massive spreading of Catholicism, for the reassertion of Jesuit, if not power, at least some influence. And to be fair, there were American Jesuits when the terrible famines that called the First World War hit the former Russian Empire. There were some Jesuits that were in there distributing food and so on. But Herbigny, either through lack of information, lack of command of the language, naivete, or all three, massively misinterprets what his range of activities might be. Things go very, very bad in a sort of, third man Orson Welles frantic strumming of a zither as you're running down the sewer kind of thing. He gets out with his life. Others are not as lucky. They are left behind to the tender mercies of the Stalin crowd. It's a bust. And to just mention something about Jesuit culture, there is this business of silencing, or it's described as voluntary silencing generally. But Herbigny, he lives for many, many years. He ends up being a man with a long white beard, living somewhere in southern France. He does not produce memoirs, his version of what happened or his insights. He's sworn to silence. I don't know what records are available, perhaps none about him. But this, every Dostoevskian memory of the Blackbirds, the Jesuits, is inflamed by these events, plus that generation of Jesuits and also Catholic prelates in general come away with the sense that these Bolsheviks, you cannot do business with them. They will just do bad stuff. So very, very quickly, just a few words about Jesuits in these lands. Moldavia, part of the old kingdom of Romania that was much smaller before the First World War. Jesuits make multiple expeditions to Moldavia. They make the first one in 1743. And again, it is suggestive of their approach to things that they send a historian out there with just two other guys, and it is a typical Jesuit way from this period of approaching things, which is get the ear of the prince. Convince the prince that the prince's son would benefit from education from our system. Offer to write a history of the country. Play up the deep-seated and inevitable connection that all Romanians that I've ever met feel with Rome. Like they name their kids Ovidio and things like this. So you tell them, we've just been in Rome and we have this thing we can give you. It doesn't last long, but it leaves a bit of an imprint. It affects schooling in this area. I've said a little bit about Transylvania. Transylvania does not become a predominantly Catholic land, but down until the end of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, a little over a century ago, Jesuit schools play a disproportionate role in the educating of elites. And again, the Jesuit school system is a feeder system. You start at what we would call secondary school today, and the most promising students are then moved on to higher education, and then some of those are earnestly recruited to become Jesuits themselves, and that does become part of Transylvanian history. Bukovina, again, a smaller, less well-known Romanian-speaking region, but also one where Jesuits set up communities and have quite an impact on the local Uniate Church. And I might mention too that another thing that makes Jesuits special and different, they do not live in cloister, for example, as Benedictines do. They are peripatetic, but so in that respect, you might say they resemble Franciscans and Dominicans, who at various times have been their arch rivals and enemies. But unlike those two groups, they manage to acquire property as they travel along. And also, there are more Jesuits who become confessors of powerful Catholic leaders than you would find in the other two groups. So I guess you could say punching way over their weight, having an influence not indicated by their actual numbers. But the other thing is, Jesuits, historically, this would still be true, attract not only people, men. There were 2 women Jesuits, but I don't get to tell you about them tonight because they never went to the Orthodox East. But it's a male organization. It attracts men with gifts. It also has attracted from time to time rule breakers, people who push envelopes, people who do it their way, people who don't answer emails until they've already sold the stuff or whatever it happens to be. And that is a two-edged sword, of course. But in remote areas, in pre-railroad period, you get a good man, a strong man, a charismatic man who is willing to pour his life and soul into establishing a school or building the most beautiful church in the district. And it's amazing what gets done. Just a word or two quickly. The Slavic Balkans, also at least partially part of the Orthodox world. The Jesuits are in and out of Serbia. One of my hopes before I die is that I'll actually figure out what happened to the Jesuit Church in Belgrade. In the 1930s, the cornerstone of this church was located and was in a museum, but that was before Nazis, Tito, and Milosevic, and the bombing of that city. So that story is not completely sorted out. But the Jesuits had this model. They would build a public place, a public open space for their processions, their public PR events, if you want to call them that. There'd be a school, there'd be a residence, and of course there would be a glorious church. And they actually built this in Belgrade, although because most of the Jesuits who did this are Croatian, historically, this is not something you sort of randomly walk down the street in Belgrade and ask them, where's the stuff the Croatians built? Because you won't get the answer you want. But Bulgaria, 19th century, big question mark here. French Jesuits go to Bulgaria. Bulgaria is still a semi-dependent possession of the Ottoman Empire until about 1878. They're in there, they're out of there. My guess is they did far more than we know about. If anybody is looking for a fascinating dissertation topic, let me suggest Jesuits in Bulgaria, a reappraisal as a topic. And then we come to the fall of the wall and modern times. And remember, when we get to 1989, this is well into the third incarnation of the Jesuits. The Jesuits have returned to the Orthodox world in many, many, many places. They are in Kiev, they are in Moscow, they're in Novosibirsk, and I've had the pleasure of meeting them. It is notable that while some things have completely changed, I don't see any heavy-duty proselytizing going on with modern Jesuits, for example, in Moscow or Tomsk. Social justice is a very high priority in Montenegro and Bosnia. They're working with refugees and so forth. But there are some themes that persist. I didn't meet any ethnic Russian Jesuits in Russia. There are ethnic Ukrainian Jesuits in Ukraine, although many are Poles, and that doesn't always go over that well. So one thing is there's the new vision, which is about sharing. It's about emphasizing a merciful God. It's about social outreach. It's about interacting with other religious groups, although I did hear a few negative comments in Novosibirsk about Orthodox clergy. They're not best friends forever yet. So there's some new things. The Jesuits that I know who work in Moscow, for example, one gentleman is from Chile, another gentleman is from New Orleans, and so forth. They know the language, they know the culture. They're Jesuits, but they're not local products. And I'm very low on time, so I'll just walk through this very quickly. Yes, there were Jesuits in Ethiopia. No, it didn't go well. I'm just including that because it's part of the Eastern Church. Martyrdom is big in the early era. Armenia, it went quite a bit better. Jesuits of the early period, I'm talking about early times. Jesuits seem to have a soft spot for the Armenian tradition. They seem very sympathetic to it. And remember, there are Armenians scattered around the Balkans before Hitler, Ceausescu, and other bad guys messed that up. And also, if you really want to get a feel for how the Jesuits are relating to another group, see what they say about women. And I found a quote that a Jesuit said, well, there was a procession and there were Armenians. This was actually in Transylvania. And those Armenian women, they're so virtuous. They're so modest. This is good. Okay, Syria, Aleppo, a big jumping off point. Maronite Christians there. This is a project of the Jesuits to master Arabic and to move into other Levantine lands. The Copts of Egypt, a complex on-again, off-again romance that didn't stick that well. There's much more to say here, but I can't keep you too late. Okay, to move to a conclusion quickly, Vatican II is both a product of and a factor in the new Jesuits. A man named Karl Rahner, a very important theologian, I see heads nodding. Yes, he was a Jesuit. Yes, he lived in Innsbruck. Yes, they told him to shut up for a while. But eventually, he writes a lot of things that are very important for Vatican II. So Vatican II has opened the doors to liberation theology, to very, very different roles for Jesuits. And I would even go so far as to say that while today's Jesuits living today are very bright guys, they are bright in slightly different ways, I'm generalizing, from their forebears of a century ago. They are less likely to hang out in universities with myths of the university and more likely to be out in the field. They are much more open to interaction and collaboration with non-Catholics even. But Jesuits no longer represent Western imperial powers, Austria being the most important in the old days, but they still represent the West. And this may not be news to anyone in this room. You seem like a pretty hip group. But John Paul II was extremely popular in the West, and he was a very photogenic guy and even waved around a hockey stick at one point. He wasn't that popular in Russia. He was a nosy Polish, now he wasn't a Jesuit, of course, but he was a nosy Polish guy who was sticking his stuff into other people's business. And when you add in all the years that Poland was dominated, if not outright ruled by Russia or the Soviet Union, that hurts that much more. So, and while JP2, John Paul II, was by no means the best friend of the great misgivings with which many Eastern prelates viewed his overtures is a pretty good suggestion of how day-to-day Jesuit interactions on the ground were also viewed by other Orthodox people. Humanitarian outreach is a very key part of it. Suspicions do remain. Liberation theology, which John Paul II was never on board with. In fact, it is part of the Jesuit lore that Pedro Rupe, who many Jesuits regard as already a saint, that his decline in health and subsequent death immediately followed a big argument that he had with the pontiff over obedience. At least that's a story that gets told in Jesuit refectories. Okay, future prospects. Robert Taft, a very distinguished Jesuit scholar of the East, has said it is time to let go of the entire notion of unia. And he even says we're already united. There's no point in writing these rules and having a checklist and trying to make it fit a Procrustean bed of bureaucracy. And along with that, I also have to mention, I enjoyed looking at the beautiful icons in your chapel here. There are now Catholic Jesuit scholars of icons who have published some very fine works on the subject that I think show tremendous insight. And these are not Russian or Ukrainian guys. That they are from the Central or Western European area. Challenges with authoritarian government situations and a reinvigorated Orthodox identity. I don't know exactly what happened. It is officially an unsolved murder. But the head of the Jesuits in Moscow a decade ago was murdered in his flat. Now, people do get murdered in Putin's Moscow and no one is brought to trial. That's not a completely rare occurrence. But there are problems that run very deep. And a reinvigorated Orthodox identity in any of the countries that we've just been covering would create a difficulty for an organization that is both rootless cosmopolite types, but ultimately Westerners. The Jesuit order, like most Catholic religious orders, has experienced a decline in numbers. Many of my Jesuit friends and colleagues are very elderly at this point. And there is a new crop coming up, but they are more likely to be from Sri Lanka than Cincinnati. Okay, or from Mumbai than Boston. There is a global shift, and with the global shift comes inevitably changes in emphasis, self-selection, and self-selection is so important in this whole process. So decline and change. Also you find Orthodox populations in areas that the old Jesuits had never thought about. Sydney, Australia. And of course, Toronto, for that matter. So what does it mean to interact with Orthodox people? In the 16th century, it meant walking to the next village that looks like something from Fiddler on the Roof, and here's a cow and a pig. And today it means something profoundly different. And many of the assumptions and many of the problems, but also many of the prospects simply look very, very different. I think I'd really better conclude. You've been a very patient audience, but I'd be happy to entertain your questions as long as there are questions. Yes, thank you for your time.